Strawbery Banke Museum in Portsmouth, New Hampshire is unique to the realm of living history museums in that the vast majority of the buildings that make up the museum are original to the spot where they stand. Also, unlike its peer institutions such as Colonial Williamsburg or Old Sturbridge Village, Strawbery Banke interprets each of the homes to a different time period, so visitors can find themselves visiting a tavern set in 1777 and then go into 1942 simply by crossing the street, or continue around the corner and walk into the 1950s, the last decade before the neighborhood was converted into an outdoor museum, which opened in 1965. It meant the world to me that Strawbery Banke welcomed my podcast to have its first EPS Podcast live event in one of its houses for 2 days in August. Before I recorded with visitors, I sat down with the museum's Director of Education to analyze Strawbery Banke itself as a primary source. I'm being joined by Becky Coppola from Strawbery Banke. What is your position as the in education department, correct?
Yes, I am the Director of Education here.
And this is a museum I have much experience with. I used to work here as a role player and an interpreter, and we're going to take a brief look right now at the museum itself as a primary source, as a product, because, after all, culture, popular culture, any kind of culture is what a society creates. And this museum, it's an old neighborhood, right? I mean, it's not like it was constructed as a museum.
Right. So it's a neighborhood that people have inhabited for thousands of years. So the first people that lived on the land were the Abenaki. Mm-hmm. And then when the European colonizers came, that's when the structures that we see here started to be built.
Right across the hall from the room we're in right now is an entire exhibit about the people of the Don land, right? The Abenaki, the Wabanki, and that seems to be, and so I guess part of the trouble with nailing down an exact time period of the museum is that it has itself changed quite a bit. So it's almost like like a television series where the original first episode is a product of the time, but then by existing it then contributes to the culture and kind of it's a cyclical thing. So by the time you get from when this museum was incorporated to then created and open to visitors to now, a lot has changed as far as the direction and the behavior and the ideas behind it, correct?
Yeah, for sure. So I think when the museum was first conceived, the idea was especially to save the buildings and to be a preservation organization. Over time, more and more buildings have opened, and the objects that go in, we've collected more and more objects. And so for a long time, Strawbery Banke was a place to show off the objects and to preserve the material culture of the people that lived in the neighborhood. And today, I think we're progressing to telling more stories. And it's a unique place because of that. Because museums in their existence have changed over the many years. Like I think about museums that opened up in the first part of the 20th century were more or less just like, here's a bunch of stuff, like you said, material stuff, oddities, like here's a two-headed snake, here's a bunch of glass, beads that we found, or, just like random things that a lot of it has to do with what visitors you have coming in and what their interests are and what they are able to actually get out of a museum. And so we're talking roughly late 50s, early 60s that this museum came about. And why was preservation such an important part of the recipe then? What was going on locally, nationally, that they said, no, we need to save these houses? Yeah, I think that throughout the 20th century, you start to see more house museums open, and people got very interested in saving the things
Yeah.
that of the past. And when you come to a place like Strawbery Banke was, this was a time when Williamsburg and, Plymouth were starting up, and it was sort of this new idea of outdoor living history where you can take a whole site and turn it into a place to preserve.
And that was especially exciting for 20th century people because there was so much technological change from the colonial era to the early republic to all the way. I mean, the 19th century is pretty astounding as far as the technological advances from the beginning to the end of the century. But by the time you get to the 1930s and the 40s and the 50s, we're so far removed that they want to be immersed into a time period that they can never themselves experience and to see what it was like, and a very romanticized version of it.
Yes.
And so, if I'm not mistaken, Strawbery Banke was originally thought to be, it was going to be like the Williamsburg of the North, right? It was going to be strictly one time period. It was just going to be colonial, right?
Yeah, so there have been a lot of ideas about what Strawbery Banke should be, and early on it was, to save those buildings, the 18th, early 19th century buildings, and create, like a village.
Yeah.
That was probably from the colonial period.
When did because one of the things that really makes this museum stand out and has for a long time is that when you walk into any of the buildings, you're in a totally different time period than the one you were just in. And other museums, they're great. Sturbridge Village is really nice, but that's set specifically in, I think, 1832 or something like that. And then same thing with Williamsburg. Throughout the day, they go through the Revolutionary War era, but that's pretty much it. They don't venture into, like, we have houses here. I say we, I part of it, but you have houses here that represent 1919 and 1800. Like a total span of history. When did that start to change for the museum?
I think the museum sort of opened gradually. So a few buildings were open, and over time we've been able to open different exhibits. And so it's somewhere along the line, I think, this idea that the better, when you look at a house and you look at the sources you have and you look at who lived there over time, I think it became clear that if we could choose by the story rather than just by this single time period, that we could, tell a more enriching story, a more encompassing story of America changing.
I think about 1980s, 70s, 80s, especially 1976, the bicentennial. There's a lot of people dressed in colonial attire throughout that entire year, looking forward to the 200th anniversary. But one of the activities I've done in my classrooms before is we compare paintings of depictions of the creation of the Constitution, and they have changed dramatically over the centuries. And there's one that came out for the bicentennial of the Constitution in 1987, and it's completely unlike the others, where it shows, instead of just a side view where you can totally confuse it with the Declaration of Independence because it's the same room and everything, you're basically seated next to the other delegates, and you're looking straight on at the president's chair, and you're in the room, you're immersed into it, and it's almost like you are part of the fabric of the quilt. And so it seems that was probably around the same time that Strawbery Banke had that eureka moment too, where it was, all right, instead of just, all right, everybody's in 17 something, where we are now is not, there's been a lot of changes, kind of like the Constitution. There's been many changes that reflect the times, and so this is almost like a quilt in itself, this neighborhood.
Yeah, I think it takes recognizing that there's more than just one contributing, event to history, that it's ongoing, that it's constantly evolving, and that, even though we're sitting here in 2022, 50 years from now, there's going to be people wanting the history
Right.
of, you know, the late 20th century.
Yeah,
Or the,
they're
so,
like, hey, where's that guy with the podcast? You know?
Yeah, so it continues to go on. Yeah, and I think that what we really strive to do is to allow everyone to see themselves here and to
give
see
agency,
themselves in the
really.
story.
Yeah. And
connect.
so it's funny because the behaviors and ideas that were conveyed originally were preservation, mainly because of urban renewal, right? I mean, that was like the post World War II mentality of. I mean, I think it's two-pronged. One was the atomic age. If everything can be destroyed the same way, why build things differently? You know, so architecture back then was very bland and space agey. I always think about. I don't know if you've ever been to to Empire Plaza in Albany, New York.
Oh, no.
And if I have any listeners in Albany right now, please don't take offense. But it's their Capitol building is gorgeous. It's a beautiful. It looks unlike any other Capitol in the country. Very Gothic. But then they have this plaza that was built in the 60s, I think it was. And you could tell that they were trying to be all space agey with it, like, and they have this one like auditorium that looks like an egg, and they just call it. It looks like UFO landed sideways, and it's all, you know, covered in pavement, and it's like, I'm sure there was because Albany's a pretty old city. I'm sure there's a really nice neighborhood or historic neighborhood. But now it's all covered in pavement, and there's grass growing up through the cracks, and it's all, kind of outdated already. And so that was the fear here, right? Was that the same thing was going to happen to this part of town?
Yes, yeah. So that's how Strawbery Banke sort of originated, was that the city was going to take over this neighborhood by eminent domain and turn it into something. So, and that was with money from the government for urban renewal. And there was a group of people in town that had seen, gas stations and bowling alleys going up, and tearing down all of these historic homes. And they kind of got together and just made a case for, let's not tear this down to build something else. Let's turn it into a cultural heritage site and preserve our past.
And we're glad that they did, because otherwise we wouldn't have this draw, because I mean Strawbery Banke is a major draw to the city. People come from all over the world to check it out here and enjoy it. And so I guess the behaviors and idea have since recycled to now where it's part of Portsmouth. It's part of New England, where if you're in this town, hey, check out Strawbery Banke, see what they have going on new. And whenever you listen to this, listeners, the museum is open 100% between May and October, right? May 1st and October 31st.
Generally, I would check the website.
Yeah.
Make a trip.
And then in the wintertime, the big event is the candlelight stroll, right?
Yes. So that's usually the first 3 weekends in December, where the whole place is holiday.
Yeah, and I would say, like I said before, it's created a culture of its own just by existing. And so, thanks for stopping by and talking Strawbery Banke, and hopefully I'll do another one of these remotes in a few weeks, and we can do another question about the museum.
Great.
Thank you very much. Later, Strawbery Banke's archaeologist Alex Martin stopped by to continue analyzing the museum, this time regarding the intended audience. All right, I am here with Alex Martin, who is the chief archaeologist?
The only archaeologist.
The only archaeologist here at Strawbery Banke Museum in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And we're going to continue our conversation that I started earlier with the Director of Education about the museum itself. Because as a cultural landmark, which it is, it may have started one way back in the 1960s, but as time has gone on, it is a representation of the society and the values since then. So the question that you chose to continue this talk about Strawbery Banke as a primary source is, who is the intended audience or user of it? And so from your perspective, especially with your background as an archaeologist, when you present your findings, who are you thinking about?
Yeah, I'm thinking about mostly the people who originally used the items that we find here. So that is households, it's families, it's children, it's enslaved Africans, it might be merchants or traders or manufacturers or purchasers. Mm-hmm. But I also think a lot about the audience of our museum visitors and of my students and of people who might learn about the museum through articles or our website or our social media posts, kind of micro-blogging the artifacts that we find. So a lot of the objects in our archaeological collection here today are reaching a much broader audience than the original intended audience of them.
It's so I used to work here. I've mentioned that a few times on the recording today, and one of the things I always liked about it is especially when the archaeological digs would happen and they display some of their findings, is bridging the time and showing that even though maybe 200 years has passed, people really haven't changed that much as far as what they're interested in doing. Kids will be kids. They're going to still want to play with toys. Depending on their occupation, it may look a little bit different, some of the technology that they use, but ultimately they're looking to do the same kinds of things. So it is part of the mission of the museum to inform the visitor that even though we might dress differently than those who used to live here, we're not that disconnected.
Yeah, I always try to make that point, especially when I get the chance to work with our fourth graders who come on field trips. Because as an anthropologist, I think that one of the gifts of educating about anthropology and about humanity is appreciating not only the diversity of human culture throughout time and across space today, but also all our similarities. And so, I try to make that point that although we have really different technologies, our fundamental needs are still pretty similar, and our wants, so we have the basic, we need to feed and clothe ourselves, but we also want to connect to other people, we need to exchange items, we need to play. So if we look at different layers or different deposits from an archaeological site over time, we'll find food containers, and if we go back before European contact, we're going to find Native American hand-built ceramics. We won't find their baskets or their birch bark containers, but is that really so different than a piece of a fiesta-ware platter that we find from a mid-20th century deposit? I think not really so much. Or, we might find clay marbles and then a little later on glass marbles, or bone buttons and then later on glass and then plastic buttons. So we can really, depending on how we group artifacts together, if we think about their use and the people who needed to fill a basic need or want, they're still pretty much the same.
What does that say, therefore, about, because this museum and museums like it have existed for the better part of the 20th century. I know this one is on the newer side by comparison, and I talked earlier with Becky about the evolving mission of living history museums and neighborhood museums and things like that. But so you have, anybody born after 1965 easily has grown up with this kind of museum and this form of history being extended to them. What is there anywhere else to go with that in the coming years? Or because you hear comedians like Jerry Seinfeld talk about Williamsburg and how boring it is. It's like hearing I got to watch some guy churn butter for a while, or that kind of making jokes about it because it's part of our culture. It's there's every part of the country has something like this. So as the audience is used to it, what can a place, and you can only speak for Strawbery Banke, what can it do to match the changing culture?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I look forward to listening to the podcast and see if other people have different answers to this. I think that one of the exciting developments that we can pursue in the next few years is making our collection more accessible. And I mean that on like any level that you can think of. So more physical access to our houses and to our objects for people who get here. Financial accessibility for people who think that, museums aren't affordable for them. Making the museum, not have that boring churning butter kind of thing.
Which, for the record, I don't think is boring, but
don't churn butter here. But also technologically accessible. So there are all kinds of new technologies. My intern this summer decided to teach herself photogrammetry, which is the process of taking dozens of photos of an object and turning it into a 3D model that you can manipulate on a computer screen or a phone screen. And I talk a lot. I offered a virtual field school the last 3 years throughout COVID to give people an opportunity to learn some of the methodologies that archaeologists use to collaborate with one another and to do some remote archaeology, like looking at LiDAR data of landscapes.
Absolutely.
A whole other thing. But so in the context of those field schools, we had a lot of good conversations about how important that tangible access to material culture is. And that's not always going to be physically possible. But with technology like photogrammetry, I think we can replicate that in an exciting way. And so somebody, in another country can log on to Strawbery Banke's website and essentially touch one of the objects, turn it around in their hand, look at the maker's mark at the bottom, read a little bit about who might have used or played with it or whatever. Access in the future, I think making it just more accessible on every level.
I don't see the museum field going backwards at all. I don't think that's in the cards whatsoever. I was talking earlier about how, museums themselves are products of their time period and their audience. And, 100 years ago or a little bit more, it was the, just kind of oddity collection that museums would have. Just like, here is a, arrowhead from the other side of you wouldn't have any other access to seeing it other than if you went to that museum. But nowadays, and when you go to a museum that's opened up in just recent years, it's very much more smartphone centric. I went to the Dr. Seuss Museum a couple years ago, and that's pretty much not all that it is, but almost every room has a place to do a selfie with a character or some kind of interactive type thing that you can take home with you, kind of like what we're doing right now. And that kind of thing. So it matches the audience. But what we're hoping for, I guess, is that there's not just like a certain subsection of a society that are museum goers.
Yes, I do not want that.
That's everybody is a museum goer.
Yeah, not in the same way. Not the same type of museum, maybe. Maybe they don't all plan their vacations around it. But yes, I think anybody who likes stories, I think, can like a museum. And I think that's a big difference between like those Cabinet of Curiosity style collections that are the earlier 20th century and the type of museums we have today, is that there's much more of a focus on telling a cohesive story. And I think technology plays into that, like trying to not make sure everybody has the exact same experience, but make sure that everybody gets that through line of a cohesive story, or a Strawbery Banke, maybe it's a dozen stories. But I think too of the Dealey Plaza Museum about JFK in Dallas, Texas. You cannot go through that museum without their audio guide. And there is material culture there. There's stuff to read, videos to watch, but you really get a cohesive story that they guide you through without ever, following you around and telling you anything.
Yeah, it's the old ways are, again, I was just over in Amsterdam, and we went to the Anne Frank House Museum. And very similar, where it's, they didn't change the building at all. They did. They made alterations to make it a museum, but the living quarters of the families and hiding and everything are still intact. And you walk through with a listening device rather than a tour guide.
Yeah.
And then the audio actually ceases there are no audio guides as you're walking through the actual rooms that she was inhabiting, and as a way to make sure that you're not distracted.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it feels like you're just anywhere and you could be listening to any, just another device with a QR code. And, are there still QR codes here at Strawbery Banke? I feel like for a while there was the Listen to the Landscape.
Listen to the Landscape has been kind of phased out in favor of a newer app. I don't think there are QR codes anymore. I don't think the QR code is over, though.
No, it's not. But it just, just case in point, showing you how the audience has changed quite a bit as far as, instead of having to take a picture of a QR code at different stops, just have an app, and just, go from place to place like that. So thank you so much for stopping by and chatting about this. And by the end of, hopefully I'll do another stay here at Strawbery Banke in a couple weeks. And, by the end of it all, I might piece together an entire line of questioning to be answered. But thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me.
Talking.
Good luck.
Welcome to Season 2 of the EPS Podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening to what you've heard so far. Short episodes like this one, which are the results of my EPS Podcast live outings, are being delivered on Tuesdays, while full-length episodes, where primary sources are analyzed completely, air on Thursdays. If you like what you hear, consider becoming a patron by going to patreon.com/EPS Podcast. Follow the show on social media, including YouTube, and especially Instagram. I look forward to listening again to the EPS Podcast, where everything is a primary source.